Hello everybody, in this video we're going to review Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Here's a picture of the Jordan River right here, and these are pretty important books because they mark a transition point. We are past the Pentateuch now. We've come to the end of the life of Moses. Moses has said farewell to the second generation of Israelites because he's going to die outside the Promised Land, but under Joshua, and as we get into Judges and Ruth as well, we cross the Jordan, we cross into, finally, the land that God had promised the people all the way back to Abraham. So Moses says farewell in the plains of Moab here. He dies and is buried, it's at least suggested by God himself, outside the land, and the people cross the Jordan River and move into Jericho under the leadership of Joshua. So here's a map that kind of zooms out a little bit. The people of Israel travel through the wilderness here, through Moabite territory. Here's where Balaam and the donkey, that story happens, up north and crossing over west across the Jordan River into Jericho and into all of this Canaanite territory here. So one of the themes I'm hoping that we took from Joshua was this theme of insider versus outsider. So Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute, becomes part of the family of Israel and an ancestor of Jesus. The Gibeonites, even though we kind of debated together in class, were they right or were they wrong to trick Joshua into making a treaty with them, they become part of the family too and get protected by Joshua as such. And then you have Achan, who's an Israelite, part of the family of Israel, part of God's covenant people, who keeps forbidden plunder from Jericho and eventually is stoned to death because of that. So what I want you to take from this as part of our review, though God does reveal himself as this conquering warrior king to the Israelites, as we said was their understanding, their ancient tribal understanding of what God and the other gods were like, he does tell them to destroy the Canaanites using this imagery, but there's still an invitation to everybody, to Rahab, to the Gibeonites, to others, to come into the family of God. In other words, being a true Israelite means you have to be a person of faith, not just somebody who inherits that because they're born as an Israelite. And that's the challenge then for you and I too. So the first 12 chapters of Joshua, we cross the Jordan River. There's the battle at Jericho, the battle at Ai after Achan is stoned. They have success there. And then Joshua, we saw, moves through all the southern Canaanite nations and cities, destroys them, defeats them, before then moving north and doing the same here. So we've got the stories of the sun standing still, God raining down hail on these kings that Joshua pursues, defeats, and destroys, south to north. And we read near the end of this section, the land had rest from war as a result of that. So then the second half of the book is basically Joshua dividing up the land among the 12 tribes. We said that Levi doesn't get any special territory because they're the tribe of priests, so they're scattered around throughout all the tribes. And then Reuben, Gad, Manasseh, earlier in the book of Numbers, had made kind of a deal with Moses. Hey, let us settle on the eastern side of the Jordan as long as you help us fight the Canaanites here, Moses says. You may later settle on this side. So the land is divided up, and in the final 2 chapters, the covenant is renewed. And there's that famous verse that many of you have in your houses displayed somewhere. Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord, Joshua says, right before he dies. So kind of his farewell speech here, like Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. Follow God, remember who you are, remember who you need to serve. And the people respond, yes, we will. So Joshua, all together, a pretty positive book depicting how obedient, how trustworthy, how courageous, how committed to God the people are. And we ended with this thought: Joshua, Jesus both mean the Lord saves. But now, moving into Judges, God says, I brought you up out of Egypt. I brought you to this land that I swore to give your ancestors. That's the book of Joshua, right? I'm not going to break my covenant with you. You need to keep up your end of the bargain, though. Break down the altar, smash the idols, drive out the people of the land, cleanse this land from evil and sin. But the Israelites, according to Judges at least, don't do that. Right? Joshua presents this kind of exaggerated picture. Maybe we crushed them, we destroyed them, we defeated them, and Judges comes along and says, it's not that simple. It wasn't that positive. Actually, they failed to dislodge people here and here and here. Canaanites still remain, and God says, all right, Have it your way. I'm not going to keep driving them out before you. They're going to become snares and traps for you along the way. So we saw through Judges, you get this constant cycle of sin now, right? The people turning from God, God judging them, handing them over to enemies, the people turning back to God, God sending a judge to rescue, and then a period of peace while the judge lives before the judge dies, and the cycle starts over again. So from Ehud to Deborah, and Deborah's friend Jael, right, pounding the tent peg through the enemy general's skull. We start pretty positive. Othniel before Ehud even, Caleb's younger brother, Ehud, Deborah, all pretty successful overall. Gideon and the 300 men against the Midianites, positive, but the beginning and end of his story, God, he doesn't trust God at the beginning, he tests God, and he ends up making an idol kind of unintentionally at the end, so we're starting to slide a little bit further down. Then you have Abimelech, who kills 70 of his brothers to try to become king before he gets a stone dropped on his head. And there's my daughter in my depiction of this using blocks and little kid toys. You have Jephthah, right, who makes this foolish vow and ends up having to sacrifice his own daughter, slaughters 42,000 of his own people because they can't pronounce a word right. Shibboleth, right? You have to say that to prove you're not an Ephraimite, not an enemy, and clearly not a good example of a judge there either. And finally, Samson, right, who only really succeeds in doing what God wants him to do, fighting the Philistines, when his women, the women that he's attracted to, the one that he marries, and then Delilah later when they're threatened. So here's a way to kind of sum up Judges. It's a spiral, right, this 5-step cycle. It's a downward spiral, I would say, of just further and further chaos. So Othniel, the Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Jephthah, Samson, and ending with that pretty gruesome story of the Levite and his concubine that we looked at together. Things just slowly, steadily get worse and worse and worse. The spiral goes down and down. And in the last 4 chapters, we get this repeated, right? In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as they saw fit. So kind of holding out hope that maybe if we had a king, things would get better. At the same time, there's kind of an irony to that, we'll see, because when we get to the story of the kings, things don't get a whole lot better. Ruth, though, kind of a breath of fresh air. In the days when the judges ruled. So Ruth takes place during this time period of all the judges. And yeah, a breath of fresh air after the chaos and the violence and the cycle of sin that we see in the book of Judges, and acting as kind of a bridge, too, to 1st and 2nd Samuel when we meet David, and the end of Ruth shows that David is a descendant of Ruth. So it kind of connects Judges to 1st and 2nd Samuel, and I think it shows what can still be possible when you follow God's law. So even in the days of the Judges, when things are not going well at all, here's what can still be possible when you obediently follow the Lord in his ways. So just as a summary, chapter 1, Naomi and her family go to Moab because of a famine. She loses her whole family there. But her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who is a Moabite, pledges to stay with her and go back with her to Bethlehem. When they arrive back in Bethlehem, Boaz, a close relative of Naomi's, we find out, obeys God's law to leave the edges of the field for the poor, for Ruth specifically, to gather from. So they're in Moab. Because of famine, they return back here to Bethlehem, and Boaz has mercy on Ruth, allows her as a poor person, as a widow, as an alien, a foreigner, to gather from the edges of his fields. Naomi, chapter 3, convinces Ruth to approach Boaz then and basically propose to him in the middle of the night. So we looked at Ezekiel 16, which showed that imagery of God spreading the cloak of his garment, the corner of his cloak, his garment, over Israel, as sort of a symbolic way to say, you are now mine. I am going to marry you. And Boaz agrees. And in chapter 4, he marries her. He acquires, he redeems, he purchases, buys back the lost property of Naomi, fulfilling that obligation in God's law as well for that closest relative to keep property, including widows, within the family. They have a son named Obed who becomes the grandfather of David. And that's why, again, it's kind of a bridge from the time of the Judges to 1st and 2nd Samuel when David becomes the main character. So lessons, challenges, just to kind of sum up, and these are on that second Ruth handout that I gave you. First of all, God has a special heart for the poor, for the widow, the orphan, the alien, 3 groups of people that come up again and again in the Pentateuch. God sometimes works behind the scenes. He's not mentioned a whole lot in the book of Ruth, just at the beginning and at the end, but behind the scenes is how he sometimes works. And then finally, God's grace extends through Israel, Boaz specifically in the story, to all nations. A Moabite woman, think of that, becomes an ancestor of Jesus.